Hello and welcome back. Today I'm going to be doing a gouache painting in my sketchbook. It's been a while since I've painted with gouache, and so it was really fun getting back into it. And this time I decided to change up how I've been using my gouache. In the past, I've put gouache in my half pans, like typically what you put your watercolors in, let it dry it, and just reconstitute it as I was using it. And I liked it, but I struggled getting consistent opacity and mixing it in a consistent way that I enjoyed. And so I decided to try using my gouache straight from the tube. And so I put it on this glass palette that you see. It's gray on the background so that I have a neutral color to kind of judge the value of the colors I am mixing. Now the colors I'm laying out from left to right are Quin Violet, Quin Rose, Cad Red, Gamboge, Azo Yellow, Cobalt Blue, Indigo, Dioxazine Purple, and then Zinc White. That's me adding the Quin Violet because I decided I wanted it closer to the red than to the violet because that's where it falls on the color scheme. And now I'm just sketching out my basic drawing using my pencil and just doing basic shapes to guide me as I'm working. This is a Canson mixed media sketchbook. It's great for acrylic paints and watercolor. You can kind of just do a mix of everything. So it's kind of my catch-all with various mediums. And I'm just gonna let you know I am recording this during the day. Usually I do my recordings either really early or late at night, so the house is more quiet. But we recently got a puppy, and so my schedule's thrown off a little bit. So the puppy fell asleep, so I'm taking a moment to record this while the puppy's asleep. But if you hear running around, that's my kid. And the puppy is in her caged area, so don't worry, I'm not leaving my kid unattended with a puppy. She's in a safe spot, just napping. But anyways, I mixed my colors, and you can see I mixed my blues and my oranges before I started painting it onto or applying it onto the paper. That's because gouache dries very quickly, and so I found it's easier to have some of the colors I'm going to be mixing and trying to blend ready to go on the palette before I apply it to the paper. It just simplifies that whole process. The scene we're going to be painting is like a frosty late fall, early winter scene, kind of like early morning, the sun's starting to come up. And so there's lots of reds and oranges and purples and blues in this picture. And you can tell that by the palette of colors I picked, but it's going to play a lot in how we lay down the colors. And so the ground is actually going to be very red. And so I'm just mixing up some of the Quin Violet and Quin Red to get this dark magenta. With gouache, you tend to start with darker colors and then work lighter, and so that's what I'm doing. If I need to lighten a color, I'm adding white, which is different than when you work with watercolor. With watercolor, if you need something to be lighter, you just add more water, but you actually add white to make things lighter, which can throw you off if you're really used to watercolor. I know it took me a while to get used to working with opaque paints, whether it was acrylic paints or gouache or even oils, because I'm so used to watercolor that I would just try to dilute my colors with like my acrylic paints with water, but then they weren't opaque enough to cover what I was doing. And so sometimes it just takes a little bit to switch your brain into opaque medium mode versus translucent like watercolor mode. So now I'm just mixing up two different types of purples, lilac colors, a lighter one that has a little bit more pink in it, and then a slightly darker one that swings a little bit more purple. And I'm just adding in another layer to kind of this distant background, hilly area, and I'm having it be a little bit lighter where the sun's going to be hitting or shining the brightest. And the sun is going to be shining a little bit more in the center of the picture between two trees. And so everything I paint around that is going to be brighter. And then as we fade to the edges of the paper, the color is going to shift a little bit because the sun won't be shining quite as intensely. Now I'm coming into more of the midground, the area that's right behind the trees, and I'm taking some dark purple. I mixed the dioxazine purple, and I left these rough brush strokes. That's because in the reference photo, there's some bushes and plants right there, and I did some rough brush strokes to try and start to create the texture and movement that you would see if there was a bunch of long grass and bushes and trees in that area. And now I'm coming in with some oranges and some pinks and just filling in that area a little bit more. Again, I started with the dark colors and then I'm starting to build the light layers on top. Having the oranges be towards the center where the sun rays will be the brightest, and then having it fade to pink as it goes towards further away from where the sun will be. The pink I'm using has a little bit more of a blue hint to it, and so it will make it look like it's further away instead of having the warmth or the warm colors of the sun on it. This will help create depth and help create the shadows needed to get that light effect. Now, one thing I wanted to kind of talk about is brushes that you use with gouache. This gouache is a water-based gouache, so it's very similar to watercolor. You can dilute it and use it pretty much as watercolor. But gouache tends to be a little bit more abrasive and a little bit harder on paintbrushes than a typical watercolor is. I found that my brushes wore down more when I used them with gouache than I do with watercolor. I've used the same watercolor brushes for several years and haven't had an issue with it. But as soon as I started using them with gouache, then I noticed they were starting to wear down a little bit more. And that is just because gouache is a little bit more abrasive. It's a little bit harder to re-wet. And so I choose to use a Taklon brush instead of a typical watercolor brush with my gouache because Taklon brushes are a lot less expensive than quality watercolor brushes, and so I might as well use the Taklon less expensive brushes that actually work better with it. The Taklon brushes also re-wet dry gouache better than the watercolor brushes because their stiffer bristles allow you to kind of work in those paints and work in the water into them and get them going again. So I've just been kind of working in this like mid-ground area with all the like kind of bushes, and it's all textured and bumpy, and you can see that it's starting to stand out from kind of those distant mountains. And so I've kind of built that up, and now I'm going to start blocking in the trees and kind of getting their shape blocked in so then I can start working on everything that depends on the shape of the tree, like the shadows, the ground, all of that. So I'm mixing up a dark purple color, and I'm also mixing up a kind of a bright orangey red. Now this orangey red color is going to be for the side of the tree that's getting the rays of the sun, because that part is going to have a lot more light hitting it. It's going to be brighter, and so I want that to look a lot different than the side of the tree that's going to be more in shadow, which is I'm going to use a lot more of the dark purples for. One thing to keep in mind with this scene in particular is the sun is going to be kind of in the middle of the picture, and so the way the rays of light hit the trees on one side of the picture are going to look different than on the other side. So all the trees on the left side of the paper are going to have highlights on the right side of the tree. And then all the trees on the right side of the paper are going to have highlights on the left side of those trees. And then the trees more in the center might have a little bit of a highlight on both sides of them. You'll also notice the shadows are very kind of change directions depending on what side of the paper they're on. That is also because the way the sun is going to cast a shadow depends on where it's located, and so it's going to vary depending on which tree where the shadow's going to lay down. And I'm just taking my time building up the shapes of the trees. What I drew at the beginning was just a basic shape of it, and now I'm just starting to block in the midtones of the tree in the basic shapes I'm wanting. I'm trying to keep them from looking too uniform, and I want to have a nice organic feel to them. So just kind of varying things up, taking my time, and just really looking at my reference photo and then really looking at the picture and seeing what it needs. Now it's about this point I've started to block in the shadows, mixing the dioxazine purple and the indigo together. Those are my two darkest colors on the palette, and so those are going to go in the shadow areas of the tree, taking care to put those shadows on the correct side of the tree so that they look like they belong and it looks like the sun is shining on them correctly. That's one of the most important things you can do when you're painting, is making sure your highlights and your shadows are in the correct spots, because that's going to help make them look more correct. Our eyes can really pick up when it's incorrect, and we notice it. Even if we don't know that if that's the exact reason we're bothered by it, our brains pick up that something's wrong. Now, once the trees have the basic blocking in done, it's time to start blocking in the cast shadows of these trees. For this, I mixed quinacridone red and violet with a little bit of the dioxazine purple to darken it up, and I'm making sure I'm keeping the direction of those shadows, the direction they need to go in relation to the sun. And now I'm mixing up a little bit of red, of an orangey red color with the cad red and gamboge, and I'm using that to create some texture and highlights on the forest ground, and then I'm going to use it along the edges of the trees, especially the ones that are going to get the most light from the sun, just using it right along those edges. Now I mixed up a peachy orange color, and I'm starting to add more texture and highlights to the ground, but not all over the ground. I'm focusing it right along the edge of the trees, right along the forest edge, right where it meets that kind of bushy area that we painted earlier, because the sun is going to hit that edge of the forest brighter than it will further into the forest at the bottom of the page, because the sun rays can't reach that far. And so I'm making sure I'm concentrating the highlights right along the edge, and then it'll darken up as it goes towards the bottom of the picture. Now I'm coming in with a light orange color. This orange color, I'm just dabbing along, focusing it right on the edge where I want the highlights to be, but I'm trying to create a lot of texture. When it was just the magenta, it was very flat and smooth looking. And forest grounds and just ground in nature doesn't typically look very smooth. And so I want to create a lot of texture, make it look like a lot of leaves recently fell from the trees and they've started to frost over, and that there's little shadows being cast from some of them. And so I'm trying to create that. And I'm not focusing on getting really refined detail and drawing individual leaves. I just did a dabbing motion to make the to imply that those were leaves and texture. Now I'm going in with a light, super light lilac color, and I'm starting to add the impression of like frosted over trees in the distance, like that the first frost of the year had happened and that the trees have a little bit of a frost to them. So I'm just adding those in, and I'm refining some of the bushy plant areas in the distance, and just really refining what I'm doing. I'm going in with a purple color to give the subtle like details of like distant trees and branches, and just really building this up, taking my time. This is one of the nice things with gouache is that you can really just go back and layer it up. Just as long as you don't re-wet it too much and pick up those bottom layers, you can really work and refine your picture. Now I'm refining the bottom of the trees in the forested area. They were all looking like unorganic. They were looking like they had just sticks that had been stuck in the ground. And so I wanted to create roots that were coming off of them. I wanted them to be varied. And now I'm refining the shadows that they're casting and making them match the shape of the trees after I worked on them a little bit more. And you can see that there's not as many white bits of paper poking through, and that's because of all the layers that we've done so far. So just again, adding some more layers. I added a little bit of blue to those shadows. And you can see I had a little bit of a mistake. I dripped a little bit of water right there on the paper, and it picked up all of the paint that I had laid down. And so I needed to correct that. I did it very carefully with a brush and my rag, and just kind of cleaned it up. And now I'm coming in with some white paint. This is where the sun is going to be. This is going to be the brightest spot on the paper, so it's going to have the most white to it. And the tree that the water dropped on and I had to fix, see how I put a bright red spot on it? That's because there's going to be some really bright rays of light hitting it, and it's going to look very red in that area. And so I'm making sure I'm keeping that red. Just adding some of those visual rays that you kind of see when you're looking at the sun coming off of it, adding some of those in, and just building this up. This is going to take a lot of refining. It's about at this point I decided I wanted that tree to be a little bit thicker, and so you'll see me every so often coming in and thickening it up so that it stands out a little bit more against the sunlight. And this is where I started struggling with this painting a little bit more. There was a lot of things kind of going on, but one thing I really struggled with is I was starting to get in a little bit of a hurry to finish it. I had some other projects I needed to work on, and so I wanted to finish it up and get working on those other things. And that caused me to get a little sloppy with what I was doing. So you can see a little bit in the sun. I'm starting to lay down kind of like a halo of yellow around the white of the sun, but I'm laying it down over dark paint. And what ends up happening is I reactivate that dark paint because I'm mixing it so much. And so it makes it kind of muddy. And no matter what I do, it makes it really muddy. And so what I ended up having to do is just let it dry completely before I go over the paper. Another thing I struggled with is I wasn't being very careful about preventing water from dripping onto the paper. I would dip my paintbrush off and I'd forget to wipe the barrel off to make sure no water would drip down. And so as I was painting, a little bead of water would drip down on off the barrel of the paintbrush onto the paper. And the problem is that reactivates the paint. And if I dabbed it, then it would pull up the paint. And if I left it, it would make a circle. And so it was just kind of a mess. So I caution you to be extra careful, especially at these later stages of painting, because gouache is a little bit tricky in the sense of you can't count on the colors drying the same way and drying the color that they are when you mix them. And so it can be really difficult to know how to remix a specific color. With watercolors tend to dry lighter than you lay them down. So when you make a color, you tend to make it darker than what you need to be. And that's pretty consistent across the board of all watercolors drawing that way. And so it becomes a little bit easier to mix a particular color. With acrylics, they almost always tend to dry darker than what you mixed them as. And so it makes it a little bit easier to consistently mix a color or remix a color because you know that it will darken about 1 to 2 shades of what you mixed it as. With gouache, some colors dry lighter and some colors dry darker, and so it gets a little bit confusing on how to make a color again, especially if you haven't used gouache for a while. So just things to keep in mind. Just be really careful. You can see I'm trying to patch up a spot that I messed up by covering it with some red leaves. Which you can see I started adding some red leaved bushes into this mid to foreground area, and I'm having the leaves be very red so that they appear to have the sunlight hitting them, and the leaves that are closest to the sun, I'm adding a little bit of yellow to them to make it look like the sunlight is hitting them. So I'm just continuing to build up the layers, and throughout this painting process you see me kind of lay the paper down and then pick it back up, or the sketchbook, and tilt it. The reason why I sometimes lift my sketchbook up is so that I can better see what I'm doing, because I'm recording this flat, and to prevent my head from being in the frame all the time, sometimes I have to tilt it so I can better see what I'm doing. It also allows me to pull the paintbrush in better like a stroking motion if needed. So that's sometimes why I move it. So don't be afraid to move your paper if you need to, and just whatever is feeling the most comfortable as you work. You can see the pink thing on the side. That is my heat tool. It's like an embossing tool used a lot of times in crafting. I just use it to help speed up the drying process. This allows me to make sure this gouache is extra dry before I do another layer over the top so it doesn't reactivate. And now I'm just coming in and kind of reaffirming the shadows, adding the shadows that these little bush areas are going to create, because that's going to help it look even more realistic, is by having those shadows on the ground as well, not just the tree shadows. And now I'm coming in and starting to add the branches to these trees. They were looking just kind of like giant sticks in the ground, and so adding the branches really transforms them into trees. I'm trying to be careful about taking my time and not going in with too much paint, because I can always thicken up branches, but it's hard to make them thinner once they're laid down. And so just kind of lightly putting them in where I want them to be, and then I can thicken up specific branches where I want them to be thicker at. And I'm trying to keep them from looking too much the same, because if they look too identical, then they don't look natural. And the branches that are going to be closest to these rays of sun, I made more red and magenta tones, and the branches that are higher up on the paper, towards the top of the paper and towards the edges of the paper, I made more purple. Again, that's so it looks like the sunlight is hitting them. Now I'm just going in and reinforcing the sun and making the white or the brightness of the sun really pop on the paper. I think I messed with this a little too much and made the rays a little too big. So it looks, sometimes at the end result, it looks a little bit like a flower is just standing on the branch or on the tree, but there's not much I can do to change that now. But I'm just kind of reinforcing, adding kind of this glowy look to the picture and just building it up. So now I'm getting towards the end of the painting, and I'm just adding some final tweaks and adjustments. I'm adding a few highlights to some of the bumps that I've painted on the ground area to make it look like there's a little bit of a highlight, and just tweaking some of the highlights on the branches and the leaves, and just kind of looking to see what needs to be tweaked and adjusted, and just taking my time mixing colors to make sure they're the colors that I want them to be, because I don't want to go back and fix anything this late into the painting. And I'm just really analyzing the picture and seeing what needs highlights and what needs shadows. And it's about at this point I realized that I needed to have a little bit more contrast in a few selected spots of the painting. And instead of getting some more gouache paint out, I decided to use my Pentel sign pen. It has a nice dark ink to it, and it goes really well over paintings and stuff. And so I just used that to darken up areas. And then I removed the masking tape. I ripped the paper a little bit. So be careful if you're removing masking tape. And then I signed the picture and I was done. And there's a lot of things that I would tweak if I was going to do this picture again or on a full scale, or a larger size, I mean. But I'm really proud of how it turned out, especially since it was the first time I'd used gouache in quite a while. So I encourage you to get out any materials that you haven't used for a while and experiment with them and have fun and see if you can try them in new ways and just really spark that inner artist in you. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button. And if you want to see more of what I create, please hit the subscribe button. I hope you have a great day. Bye.